This conference will now be recorded.
Well, hello and welcome to the Let's Talk Business. We are doing a special edition with one of my newest favorite people in the world, Marie K. Eder, who is an author she is a retired Major General in the Army, and she has done so many amazing things. I am going to read her bio from one of her latest books. Marie K. Eder is a retired U.S. Army Major General, a renowned speaker, an author, and a thought leader on strategic communication and leadership. General Eder is the former Commanding General of the U.S. Army Reserve, Joint and Special Troops Support Command, former Deputy Chief of the Army Reserve, and former Deputy Chief of Public Affairs for the U.S. Army. General Eder is the author of The Girls Who Step Out of Line and Leading the Narrative, The Case for Strategic Communications, and The Girls Who Fought Crime. Thank you for your service and thank you for giving us your time.
Thank you so much. It's always great to feel like I'm going home.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for your service. One thing that I wanted to ask you briefly is could you tell us a little bit about your personal background? I know you also have roots in Western Pennsylvania. That may be interesting to a lot of our audience is here in the Pittsburgh area, Western PA. So tell us a little bit about that and maybe why you decided to join the Army.
Well, I grew up near Mercer, Pennsylvania, in Stoneboro, a small town, primarily originally a coal mining town, and graduated from Lakeview High School there in a class of 125, and wanted to go to college far away. And my parents wanted me to go to Grove City College, where a number of people in my family went. And so the compromise was Edinboro. And I was thrilled to go to Edinboro University of Pennsylvania, now Penn West. So I spent my first 4 years there, got a degree in English, didn't know what I was going to do with it, and stayed one more year to get a master's degree in English. By then, I had friends who had gone into the Army and they were enjoying the adventures of it. And I thought, well, I could do that for a couple of years. So that's when I became a commissioned officer in the U.S. Army and started my own longer term adventure than I had planned. I had planned 3 years and it turned into 36.
What intrigued you to stay for 36 years?
Well, I never intended to, even as time went on. My first 5 years were in the active Army, and then I transitioned to the Army Reserve. So I was the weekend warrior for a number of years in Virginia, primarily, also in Maryland, and then a little bit in Germany. And after that time, after 9/11, I came back on active duty and spent the next 12 years of my career back in active service, primarily in Washington and a little bit in Utah.
9/11
Let me
occurred, and you
Yeah,
said you
let me
came
ask
back
you
to
a
active
question
duty.
about a book that JoAnn mentioned, the girls who stepped out of line. Because obviously I've been reading that book, and for people that are not familiar with it, it's the story of several women set in World War II, back when it was actually the OSS. I think it's the Office of
Mm.
Strategic Services. It was sort of a precursor to the CIA. The CIA didn't exist at that point. Um, and one of the things I liked about the book is that each chapter is a particular story on a particular woman. So you can, at least what I've been doing is every day I read one chapter. It takes about an hour to read one chapter, and it's really cool. And then you can read all of them as you go. When you wrote the book, did you have initially a particular audience in mind? And the reason I asked the question is it reminded me a lot of a book that I read all the way back in fifth grade, and I still remember it. It was Edward L. Beach, Run Silent, Run Deep. I just picked that book randomly out of the library. I read it, and frankly, I was so excited. I was ready to enroll in the Navy. I guess I was lucky. You can't enroll in the Navy at fifth grade. Um, So did you have a particular audience in mind or not?
It just started by accident, really. I was collecting stories. The first story I had found was about Stephanie Czech Rader, who was a member of the OSS, and she was a counterintelligence agent. I also had found several other stories about women who'd done amazing things with the US military. And to me, after all of these years in the Army, I kept thinking, why don't I know this? Why don't I know these stories? Why aren't they taught? Why don't we know more about this? And so I started saving them. I found other stories as well. And I know how this sounds that, you reach a certain age and you want to read obituaries. So I had found a few obituaries of members of the greatest generation, and they were incredible stories of courage, survival, and then transition. People who had immigrated to the US and then found their way and became successful in business. And I was absolutely transfixed by that. And so I started putting these stories in a folder. I still didn't know what I was going to do with them until in 2019, I watched the Emmy Awards, and Alex Borstein from The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel stood up and accepted the award for Best Supporting Actress. And she said, in World War II, my grandmother was about to be shot into a pit. And she turned to the guard and said, what happens if I step out of line? And he said, well, I don't have the heart to shoot you, but somebody will. She stepped out of line. And for that, I am here today. And for that, my children are here today. And that's when I knew I had to put these stories together.
One of the things that fascinate me about World War II, because being in my business, one of my partners was a former tank commander in World War II. And once a tank commander, always a tank commander, you know. And I was amazed at what he would tell stories. And my dad was also, and his three brothers were in World War II. So I grew up with those stories, although every once in a while I'd be shooed out of the room when the stories would get too grisly. Uh, what of those stories of the girls who stepped out of line, which ones just stayed in your mind that you couldn't forget?
Well, you had asked me first about the audience, and I had thought the audience would be younger people, probably some military people. But in essence, what I find everywhere I go to talk about this book, that I see people who come up to me and want me to know about what their mother did, their father did, their grandparents, what they did during the war. And I think that is the audience, to teach history in a way that is personal. And I think that's how this comes across. And these stories do stay with you. Most people ask me, who's your favorite? Well, that depends on what day it is, because I
Uh,
don't want to leave anybody out and have them be upset with me. So certainly Hilda Eisen, her story stuck with me. The first time I read it, I was just blown away. I couldn't believe what she had done, not just to escape, but to survive during the time of persecution in Poland. And I go back to her story quite a bit. And I also go back to the story of the two sisters in London, the two middle-aged spinsters who lived together, worked for the government. And at a time when so many people said, well, I don't know, what can I do? They saved 26 families from certain death because they knew they could.
the other book that you wrote, and this had particular interest for me also, is my son is a police officer, and I'm very proud of him. And he's a detective. But when I saw this book, The Girls Who Fought Crime, I was just amazed at May Foley. How did you find out about May?
Well, after The Girls Who Stepped Out of Line was published, some of my girlfriends who live in Florida got their copies. And my friend Donna said, well, that's a good book, but really you should write about my husband's grandmother. I said, what was she like? Well, she was a police officer in New York starting in 1923. and stayed up through the end of World War II. So she saw the majority of events as a firsthand witness of the 20th century. And so she sent me a few newspaper articles about May Foley's adventures, exploits, and amazing work. And I was absolutely hooked on it.
You
Let
did
me ask you
research.
a question. You've covered women in the Army, in the OSS, and World War II. You've covered women as detectives, and again, I know you have a variety of books. Is there a particular sort of characteristic situation that you think still hasn't been covered well enough that could be material for a new book? Women in a particular industry, particular situation?
Well, funny you should ask. Um, I am busy working on the next one in this series, which again, I never intended to have this series, but I'm now absolutely into being able to tell more of these stories that teach me something, show me what I didn't know, and it makes connections. You know, May Foley talked about, well, some of what we did was like what the Women's Army Corps did in World War II. In the girls who stepped out of line, I found so many people who knew about others I'd written about, two of the married pilots who were in the same location. And the connections continue to amaze me because I think they're important in so many ways. So that was the long way around to come to answering the question you asked me. The next book will be about women in sports, and it's called The Girls Who Beat the Odds.
And when is that coming out?
Um, according to my publisher, it will come out in 2026,
Okay,
which
well, I
leaves me
just
a
want to
little
be on
room to
record. You
actually
heard it
publish
here
the
first.
fiction.
Uh, you wrote in The Girls Who uh, Stepped Out of Line. There was a line here that just, for me being loving history, and probably um, people get tired of me saying, but the last line on page 310, um, you said that the girls who stepped out of line not only made history, they created the future. I love that last line. And then you talk about the next step about that. So would you talk a little more about that, please?
Well, if we talk about the military, it was in 1948 that President Truman made women a permanent part of the armed forces. This was a bill that barely passed Congress, and then he signed it into law. And several months later, by executive order, he desegregated the armed forces. But this was based on performance. Both of these actions were based on performance, how these units and individuals performed, their contributions, and the difference they made. So where we are as a military today with opportunities for minorities, for women, came about because of what they did in World War II. We stand on their shoulders. Everything we have today and now is because of what they did, what they sacrificed, what they absolutely gave to us back then.
And by the way, I just want to kind of go back a little bit to something you said and reemphasize it because I know it, even though it really, World War II, I obviously wasn't alive. I'm old, but not that old. So people that are even younger than me may not realize this. It may be such a strange concept because we've made so much progress. There's still a lot of progress left to be made, but we've made a lot of progress. Let's pat ourselves on the back at least for what we've done so far. But anyway, the army in World War II was segregated, and we have obviously the Tuskegee Airmen. They've become famous, right? Uh but that comes as such a surprise, such a shock to so many people. So we also have to understand your book in this historical context of again a segregated army, back in World War II. So I just wanted to mention that because I think that may actually come as as a surprise to some people that just are younger and don't realize that. Because again, the good news is we've made so much progress, and yeah, we still have a lot left to go. The glass half full, the glass half empty, but at least let's recognize the historical context and the progress we've made.
Absolutely. And even as women came into the Women's Army Corps, and at the time it was, I want to help. I want to do something. I want to be a supporter in any way I can. So I'll join the Red Cross, or I will. And the Red Cross had something like 7 million volunteers. And in some of this research I did, by a certain point, I thought, well, everybody had a uniform of some kind because everyone was involved. And for those who joined the military, they were writing the training materials, they were writing the rules, making the regulations as they went along. Because this didn't start until really 1942, 43, and that they were able to put together these units and get them into operation so quickly is really quite something.
Is there a formal course now in the Army about women and their background and how they've contributed to the growth of the services?
There's statistics on the growth and the numbers. Yes. There's an official books by the Center of Military History, The Role of Women in World War II, and then there's a couple after that. But I think linking them is something that I find is typical with history, because we tend to study history in blocks, and we learn that block. We don't learn how the blocks connect, and that everything is just one long flow, really. So we study World War II or the Great Depression or the post-war period, but not how culturally things evolved at the same time they evolve institutionally, in terms of population growth, in terms of how people moved, where they immigrated to and from, and all of it connects. And that is what fascinates me so much now.
So the macro view in history is basically missing. Yeah. So
Now, let me ask you a question, because before we even started this recording, you mentioned that being in the Army was a lifestyle, and of course, I fully agree. Um, I spent 30 years in manufacturing. That was my lifestyle, obviously not as rigorous and as stratified as the Army, but certainly it was. When you do it for 30 years, it's a lifestyle. And I recognize that now in my personal life, I still carry a lot of that lifestyle, a lot of that mindset. I approach personal situations, personal problems, even business situations from my perspective of 30 years in manufacturing. So my question to you is, have you carried your lifestyle from the Army into your personal life or not? And if yes, how could you give us like an example of how it affects you, how you look at things differently, how you do things differently?
Well, I would love to be able to sleep past 6 a.m., but that's not happening. Um, and certainly there is the whole cultural aspect of military life, which is I don't want to be late for anything. I always want to be on time or a little bit early. So there's that had this carried over, and there's the discipline of it, the ability to multitask. And it also teaches personal discipline. And certainly for young people who join the military today, and the majority do stay 3 years, which I think is wonderful. And I do believe that we should have some form of national service, and I don't care what it is. It doesn't have to be military, but at the age of 18, have a gap year and do something larger than yourself before you go on with your life, because you'll never be 18 and unencumbered again in so many ways. So it's the timing that's carried over, the discipline, the ability to multitask. And goodness knows I have trouble dressing myself. If it's not a uniform, it'll take me 3 days to figure it out.
Well, let me ask you a quick follow up on that, because going back to your book, about the girls who stepped out of line, a lot of them became very successful in business after the war. I think that's fair to say. And so my question is, with those particular groups of people that, of course, were under these horrendous situations. Some of them were in jail and tortured, and living out in the woods and whatever. And also with people that may be in the army for 3 years, and it's not so terrible, but again, it's still a lifestyle. It's still a discipline, the uniform. Do you believe that helps them then later become more successful in business and in life? And if yes, how?
Well, again, I think it's some of those same traits for those who've had military service. It's you can count on me is the projection of it. You can count on me to be here on time. You can count on me to get my work done. You can count on me to be part of a team and to understand what it means to help the whole team move forward. And I think that some of those characteristics are what stay with people after military service and help them move on. It goes much further than the fact that I always tie my shoes the same way, and all of my shoes are tied like my Army shoes were. Some of these things you don't even realize. So I don't realize that I'm going to make a plan for everything I do. If I'm going on a vacation, I will have an agenda and I will have a plan. And goodness knows I have friends who are not happy with me when I talk in military time zones. So I'm working to get over that too.
It sounds like living with my dad and my business partner. The household was up at 6 a.m. and I still can't get out of that. My dad, we were moving at 6 a.m. And my business partner, well, 6 a.m. Weren't we up and moving? No. That's why we were successful with contractors that worked well. One of the questions that I saw in the book, The Girls Who Fought Crime, was the research that you had to do. And this research occurred basically during the COVID period. Am I correct?
On the first book, I wrote it during the COVID period. So
Okay.
I had signed the contract to write this book, The Girls Who Stepped Out of Line, in January. At the end of January 2020, the manuscript was due by the 1st of May. And 2 weeks later, everything shuts down. So I'm getting no responses from museums, universities, anywhere that I wanted to go and do research at, or even have people answer my queries. So I started buying books online. So I do have a lot of books that you open it up and it says, formerly the property of the Boise, Idaho Library, or places like this. But it brought me back to original words, which is what historians say you should always go back to the original words. Because many people wrote memoirs after the war, not to be published perhaps internationally, but for their own families. And so you have what they thought and what they felt at the time. Some of them I could tell by reading what they'd written years later, it changed. And they were protective of their image or their past, but their words at that time were very raw, real, and recent. So you mentioned Charity Adams, who was the commander of the only all-female, all-African-American unit to deploy overseas in World War II. And she wrote an autobiography in the late 1940s. So I found that book, and it taught me so much more about her as a person than I would have gotten anywhere else, because she prepared herself. She's self-taught. She graduated from high school and college. She had a degree in Latin, science, and math, and was working on her master's when she decided to go into the Women's Army Corps in World War II. And when she was given this command, she was more than ready. She had researched everything. She had given herself experiences that led her to be a great commander, because she knew exactly how things worked and how to get what she needed for her soldiers and how to put things together and be successful. And she was.
And she
Well,
would
let
not
me ask
accept
you,
any
because
discrimination.
this obviously is an incredible amount of labor and just for maybe anybody that wants to do a book on a different topic, how much were you able to do, let's say, through getting other books, online research, and how much did you actually have to go somewhere to a library to get access to something that may not be online for whatever reason? And were you ever able to get something that was even unpublished and not in a library, meaning like the family member says, hey, here's his diary, feel free to read it,
Yes.
because that really takes it to a whole new level. So how much of that were you able to do?
For the girls who stepped out of line, I also have knowledge of where to go to look for military topics. So I did some research that took me to the Army War College's, the Center for History there, Army Center for History, and I was able to do quite a bit of research of original papers from commanders in World War II, some documents, some original regulations at the time, and some of that was very helpful. But I also had the newspapers of the time, so a subscription to newspapers.com can get you access to a great variety of materials. But from that other library, I had also read Yank magazine that was published weekly in World War II, and Stars and Stripes newspaper. So you could see some of the coverage, and the coverage was all, for the most part, local. This is where so-and-so from this hometown was, and this is what he's doing. So it was news to go back home. But it was still revealing in telling you where people were at and how they felt about their mission at the time. And I just wish we could get more mail. Why haven't we gotten any mail for months? And that was, then you go back to find the story about the Charity Adams and her unit that fixed the mail backlog problem. And you go, that's how they connect. Because here's a soldier going, I just got 6 letters from you, Mom. How did that happen? And why haven't you written me in over a year? Well, it's because of that backlog, which they fixed.
which was millions of letters on backlog. It was amazing. When you're talking about research, I read in The Girls Who Fought Crime, is that it made me sick when I heard this, that records were, when the New York Police Department was moving to a new location, they just dumped thousands of files in the river. I could not believe that.
Well, the story was that, well, they were heavy and we didn't want to move them to the new headquarters. But there's probably lots of things there that are now safe at the bottom of the East River and will never come to light. But there are other documents and books, and I did go to New York and spent some time in the New York Public Library looking at training manuals, annual reports. There's a city annual report that tells you the salary of city employees. And I also had a special tour of New York with a tour guide who specializes in different time periods. And I found him online. And I'm not familiar with New York City. I know parts of it. I know how to get in and out. But what I asked him, excuse me, to do was show me where May Foley lived. Show me where she would have walked. What subway did she take? What did she see in the time frame between 1923 and 1932? And he took me all over. So I saw the speakeasies, Rockefeller Center. He told me she would have seen it being built. Would have gone in there right as the air conditioning was turned on. First building to be air conditioned in New York.
Wow.
So I got more of a sense of her as a person from that.
Did you meet May's family?
Yes, I did. Excuse me. May had 2 grandsons, Bobby and Johnny. So I talked to Johnny quite a bit. And I finally met Bobby in New York last fall.
Are they in the service? The police force?
Johnny joined a police department in Greenwood Lake. He's now retired. Excuse me. And Bobby wanted to join the police department in New York, but his vision was bad. So he joined the Army
Oh,
and has still lived in New York.
yeah.
Now, let me ask you this. You mentioned a little bit about taking a gap year and public service, maybe between high school and college, something like that. So, is that something that you would recommend also to, I would imagine, to somebody that maybe can't get into the army for a physical thing? I will tell you, in my particular case, I really wanted to be a naval aviator, but back then, at least, you had to have 2020 uncorrected. I didn't even have 2020 corrected, so for me, it was a non-starter. Uh, and frankly, it didn't occur to me to then do anything other than just the traditional route of go to college. Okay, so fine, you finish high school, you go to college. Um, what type of national service would you recommend? I mean, there's the Peace Corps, obviously we know about that, the Red Cross, there's all kinds of other organizations. Which ones would you recommend, and if any in particular, and would you recommend that?
Well, there's some states that are experimenting with this now. Maryland has a program they're beginning to bring young people into work for state government for a year. So it's kind of gaining experience in that. Or there's also the Peace Corps, and there are any number of volunteer organizations that always need help. My personal, I guess, really my personal favorite is anything to do with rescuing animals. And so I'm always in favor of that. But you didn't get the dream you had originally. And so you found another way. And we all fail at things. We all fail at, well, I didn't make the team. I didn't get what I wanted out of this. I didn't get selected for this position. But it takes us somewhere else. And sometimes where it takes us, if you still have that same drive and that same go get 'em, it's better. And I think that's true for so many. Where you end up can be better than what you had planned for yourself.
And by the way, I'm just going to plug one simply for the fact I wasn't in it, but I knew some people that were, and they had some really good experiences. And again, there's 10,000 out there, and now with the internet, it's easy to research. But I'll just plug Habitat for Humanity in particular. Again, simply for the fact that I happen to know a couple of people, and when I was doing bike rides, we do bike rides to raise funds for them. So anyway, there's a lot to choose from, but now you got in a couple.
I do have to say, going into the Army Reserves is really, my son was in the Army Reserve, and it was certainly a growing up experience for him. And it helped him through college. And he became a military police officer, and he did, he served his time. I saw more discipline in him, which he needed. It was very good. I recommend a lot of young people, men and women, to spend your time in the service. It helps you. Uh, it helps teach basic skills that you need to grow as a person. Well, I'm aware that we have talked for over 30 minutes and we have taken up much of the major's time. And we thank you very much. And we look forward to your next book. And I look forward to meeting you someday. I do have some women in sports that you may not know about, and I will send you that. Sal, would
Okay.
you like, okay, Sal, would you like to do a wrap up?
Yes, I just want to say again, thank you for your time. Thank you for your service. One last question, and we'll let you go. Um, Specifically thinking about students in high school, um, do you have any message, any words of either advice, encouragement, specifically for people in high school? Just because I happen to like that group, and having obviously been in high school myself, I think sometimes we don't get as much guidance and as much advice as we should. So for the high school people, if they're listening, any words of again encouragement, advice, inspiration before we close this out?
When I was in high school, I think in some ways I was just lost. I didn't know what I wanted to do, where I wanted to go, or what I wanted to be. And I didn't know how to get there either. I had a hard time getting into college, a hard time getting accepted. And when the Freedom of Information Act was passed and I went to look at my files, you had to go to the dean's office and they was a paper file and they left you alone and come and tell me if you have any questions, although the dean hoped there wouldn't be any. And when he came back in the room, I said, just look at this. So it's dean's list, dean's list, dean's list. And then the letter from my high school guidance counselor that said, I don't recommend Mary Kay for admission to college. She isn't intelligent enough to complete it.
Oh my.
So, and I found out in talking about this years later that this happens more often than not, more often than you would expect or even suspect. And it stunned me at the time, and it still stuns me to talk about it now because it could have stopped anything and everything I would have tried to do. So my message to high school kids now is nobody defines you but you. Not your parents, not your teachers, not your coaches. You decide who you are and what you want, and you go for it. Maybe you won't make it. Maybe you'll fail, but you'll find something else that's just as important and just as worthwhile.
Wow. That's a powerful
Well, I'll tell you
message.
what, that is a terrific ending. I have no words left. I think we're going to leave it there. Again, thank you for your time. Thank you for your service. And I'm hope these last couple minutes really have a positive impact on any high school kids that somehow stumble upon this video and have the patience to listen to it all the way to the end. So thank you again.
Thank you.